The attic smelled like cedar and old rain, the way it always had, and I remember thinking as I climbed the pull-down ladder that this was the last time I would ever make this particular trip. My mother was downstairs in the kitchen, moving slower than she used to, but still refusing the chair I'd bought her, and I had 3 days to empty 47 years of her life into boxes marked keep, donate, and decide later, which we both knew was the box where things went to be quietly forgotten. I found the photograph inside a shoebox of unpaid parking tickets from 1978, tucked between a receipt for a hairdryer and a Polaroid of a dog I didn't recognize. 2 girls at 17, arms around each other's waists, standing in front of a mirror I couldn't quite see because the flash had caught the glass wrong. On the back, in my mother's slanted looping script, the words "Me and Denise, the night everything changed." I had never heard of anyone named Denise. When I brought the photo down to the kitchen, my mother was peeling an apple with a paring knife the way she'd done my whole life, curling the skin off in one unbroken red spiral, and she looked at the photograph for exactly 2 seconds before she set the knife down very carefully on the cutting board and said we should probably order dinner in tonight. She was tired. She didn't ask who Denise was. She didn't have to. I went back up the next morning because I couldn't sleep, and I told myself I was looking for more boxes, but I was really looking for the mirror. My mother used to tell me a bedtime story when I was small, the same one over and over until I outgrew it, about 2 girls who found a magic mirror in their grandmother's parlor and made a wish that got confused on the way to being granted. I always thought she'd made it up. I always thought the way her voice got quiet at the end, the way she'd tuck the blanket too tightly under my chin and leave the hall light on, was just how mothers told scary stories to children they loved. It took me most of the morning to find the false panel behind the Christmas decorations, a rectangle of pine board that had been nailed into the studs with the heads countersunk and painted over so carefully that only the seam betrayed it. I pried it loose with a screwdriver, and there it was, wrapped in 3 moving blankets and a bedsheet from a set I remembered from my childhood, standing upright against the insulation as if someone had put it to bed. The frame was carved with a pattern of leaves that seemed to move when I wasn't looking straight at them. When I uncovered the glass, my own face looked back at me exactly the way it should have, and I felt, for a reason I couldn't name, disappointed. I carried it downstairs, and my mother said she had never seen it before in her life, and I watched her right hand travel to the frame anyway, her fingertips finding a specific whirl in the carving as if they had gone there many times before, and then she pulled her hand back like the wood had burned her. That night I woke up at 3 in the morning to use the bathroom, and I saw her through the crack of the living room door, sitting on the floor in front of the mirror in her nightgown, whispering to it in a voice too low for me to catch the words, and I stood there for a long time before I went back to bed and pretended I had seen nothing. In the morning she made pancakes and asked me about my job in a bright, brittle voice, and I let her, because I was still telling myself the reflection I'd caught of myself brushing my teeth had looked normal, that the softness around my jaw was just the bad bathroom light, that I was tired, that grief for a mother who was still alive was a strange animal, and it did strange things to a man's eyes. I believed all of that for another day and a half. The letters were in a hat box at the back of her closet, tied with a ribbon that had gone the color of weak tea, and they were addressed to my mother in a hand almost identical to hers, but pressed harder into the paper, as if the writer had been angry the whole time she wrote. Denise wasn't a friend. Denise was her twin, her mirror, her identical other half, born 4 minutes later on a February morning in 1961, and Denise had been unwritten from the family the summer they turned 17 after something the letters kept calling the incident without ever naming it. There were no photographs of Denise in any album downstairs. There was no headstone in the family plot. She had simply been subtracted, and my mother had spent 4 decades performing the arithmetic of her absence so consistently that I had grown up believing I came from a woman who had always been alone. When I brought the letters to her, she cried the way people cry when they've been holding their breath for 40 years, and she told me the story in pieces I had to assemble myself, how she and Denise had found the mirror at their grandmother's house in the country the week of their birthday, how they had made a dare of it, how they had said the words their grandmother had told them never to say and stood on either side of the glass and traded, just to see, just for a night, just to know what it felt like to be the other one. She said only one of them came home in the morning. She said she had spent the rest of her life telling herself it had been a dream, a heat stroke, a shared hallucination between two girls who read too many strange books. She said it with her eyes closed because she couldn't look at me while she said it, and I understood then that she wasn't lying to me. She was lying to herself, and I was simply in the room. The changes I had been refusing to see began arriving faster after that, as if the mirror had been waiting for the story to be spoken out loud before it felt permitted to continue. My face in the shaving mirror the next morning was not quite my face. The line of my jaw had softened by a degree that no single night's sleep could account for. My eyelashes seemed longer against my cheek when I closed my eyes. My hands on the porcelain sink looked like hands I had seen before in a photograph of a woman at 17. I did not scream. I did not break anything. I sat down on the closed lid of the toilet, and I laughed a small sick laugh because I understood, suddenly and completely, that whatever was happening had already been happening for longer than I had been willing to notice, and that my body was not being taken from me so much as it was being returned to a shape it had been quietly promised to a long time before I was born. My grandmother's letter, when I found it folded inside a Bible in the bottom drawer of the sideboard, said as much in language older and stranger than any I would have chosen. The mirror did not erase. The mirror rebalanced. A swap left incomplete was a debt in the blood, and blood was patient, and blood would wait through as many generations as it needed to find a body close enough to the original to finish what had been started. I was not being transformed at random. I had been chosen the way a lock is chosen by a key that has been cut for it since before either of them existed. When I put the letter in front of my mother, she did not read it. She already knew what it said. She told me, in a voice that had gone very small, that she had raised me alone on purpose. That she had wanted a second child once, badly, and had stopped herself, because she had been afraid for as long as she could remember that the mirror would one day find its way back to whoever in the family looked most like Denise, and she had decided, without ever quite saying the decision out loud even to herself, that if there was only one of me, then there was less for the mirror to choose from, less for the debt to land on, less risk that the arithmetic she had run away from at 17 would finally come due at her own kitchen table. She had loved me, she said, and she had also used me. She had done both at the same time for 40 years, and she did not know how to separate them now. I did not know either. I sat across from her, and I could feel my collarbones settling into a new geometry under my shirt, and I thought about how many times she had brushed my hair as a child, and I could not tell if what I felt for her was forgiveness or something older and more complicated that I did not yet have a word for. The knock at the door came late that afternoon. The woman on the porch was in her 60s, her hair the same shade of iron my mother's had gone, and she introduced herself as a relative from a branch of the family we had lost touch with, and she said it with the small, tired smile of a woman who had rehearsed the sentence many times in a car. I saw the birthmark on the inside of her left wrist, a small brown crescent shaped like a comma, and I remembered it from the photograph, from the girl in the flashlit mirror who had her arm around my mother's waist. Denise had not vanished. Denise had been alive the whole time, working ordinary jobs in ordinary towns, tracing the mirror through estate sales and obituaries and the kind of patient paperwork only the truly wronged can sustain, waiting for a night like this one. She sat at our kitchen table and drank the tea I made her, and she looked at my mother the way you look at a person you have been rehearsing a conversation with for so long that when they finally appear you cannot remember the first line, and my mother looked back at her the way you look at a wound you have been pretending is a birthmark. Denise did not shout. Denise told the truth softly, the way people do when they have been carrying it a long time and it has worn smooth in their pocket. The swap on the night of their 17th birthday had not been a dare gone wrong. It had been a decision. My mother had wanted out of a life she found unbearable, out of a body that felt like the wrong door, out of a future her parents had already picked the wallpaper for, and she had proposed the mirror to Denise with the specific intention of not coming back. Denise had thought it was a game. Denise had woken up in the morning inside a life that had been sanded down to a stump for her, disowned by parents who no longer recognized their own daughter, erased from photographs by a sister who moved across 3 state lines and never wrote, and she had spent 40 years in a stranger's skin trying to remember which of her own memories were actually hers. The story I had been told my whole life, the bedtime story of the 2 girls and the mirror and the strange dream, had been the softened public-facing version of a crime whose only witness had been the woman who committed it. I looked at my mother, and my mother looked at the floor, and I understood that the person I had grieved in advance for the last 3 days was not the woman I thought she was, and also that she was still my mother, and that both of those things were going to have to be true at the same time for the rest of my life. And then I looked at the mirror which someone, at some point in the last hour, had carried into the kitchen and propped against the wall by the sink, and I saw the reflection that had been waiting for me since before I was born, a woman in her late 30s with my mother's mouth and Denise's eyes, and a look on her face I had never worn in my life, a look of being finally, completely seen. The glass was offering me the last of it, the way a river offers itself to a stone. I could finish the swap Denise had been owed since 1978. I could give her back the years my mother had stolen, and take on the debt myself as the closing of an account 4 decades overdue. Or I could stop, here, in this half-finished shape, and refuse to be either the sacrifice or the sacrificer, and let the mirror go on being a mirror. There was no clean choice. Every door in the room led through someone else's ruined room. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, and I understood, with a clarity that did not feel like mine, that the mirror had spent 100 years being handed a story, with one narrator and one victim and one villain, and had never once been asked to reflect 3 people telling the truth in the same room at the same time. So I did not step forward, and I did not step back. I turned around and I asked Denise if she took sugar, and I asked my mother to sit down, and I put 3 cups on the table, and I said her name, my mother's name, the one she had been born with and not the one she had traded for, and I said Denise's name, and I said my own, whichever one it was going to turn out to be by morning, and I told them that we were going to sit here in this kitchen with the mirror watching from the wall, and we were going to say every true thing that had not been said in this house in 40 years, and we were going to keep saying them until there was nothing left to swap because there was nothing left hidden. The kettle clicked off behind me. The light in the window was the soft gold it gets in late July, when the day has decided to be gentle on the way out. I saw my reflection in the darkened glass of the microwave, and I did not yet know whose face it was going to settle into, and for the first time in 3 days I found that I could bear not knowing, because the not knowing was the first honest thing the mirror had ever been asked to hold.